It's time to talk about a basic concept from the faith, and that is what is the spotless bride of Christ? What does it mean for the church to be the spotless bride of Christ? You would expect Francis to be able to answer that question. And evidently, he can't because he, in a new letter on how we need to educate priests properly, basically denies that the church is the spotless bride of Christ, which comes right out of Scripture, as I will show you. Before we get to that, let's talk about a related thing, a subject I haven't talked about on this channel in a long time, the stonecutters. They are the ancient enemy of the church. And you may have seen this in passing, and I do think this is actually kind of related to what's going on. So we go to Rorate Cheli on X for this first, and they're really just reposting something from from an account called Actionnaire Reactionnaire. A book was published a few years ago that's suddenly getting a lot of attention from Catholics in the West. The book's called Lodge and Altar, which is a very controversial book by the Roman Curia's first open stonecutter. Yeah, there is one of those in the Roman Curia right now. A Monsignor Michael Wenninger, who proposes that, quote, regular stonecuttery and the Catholic faith are compatible. He's a lay vocation, a widower, and former Austrian ambassador. So to make this clear, in the Roman Curia right now is a member of an organization that if you are a member of said organization, you incur automatic excommunication. He is a Monsignor, meaning he's a priest. And for those who might be keeping score, yes, Francis actually did reiterate the church teaching on this last year, I think it was. He issued a document basically saying that you can't be a member of this organization. They reject Catholic everything, basically, and are the ancient enemies of the faith. Novus Ordo Watch chimed in on this, saying the author is a Catholic priest working for the Roman Curia. In 2019, he published a dissertation on reconciling stonecuttery and Catholicism at the Pontifical Gregorian University of Rome. That should have gotten him excommunicated. The book was published in 2020, and now it's just making the circles. So just to give you an idea of the values that are now tolerated in Rome, it should help make what we're going to talk about here a little clearer. See, with stonecuttery in mind, let's turn to Francis's new document. It's a letter on the education of priests. See, on the surface, if you were to read the whole thing, which I'm not going to do here just because it's dreadful, but if on the surface, if you read it, it actually sounds pretty good. But in reality, it's got a couple of glaring errors in the letter. So before we start the letter, let's look at what the church actually says about a specific issue. What does it mean when we are told that the church is the spotless bride of Christ? See, the church teaches that the church is the spotless bride of Christ. That means the church is holy. For to be holy, a person or an institution is to be without sin. The Douay-Rheims translation of the Bible, which is generally the English language translation that traditional Catholics go for when looking for English translations, gives us this quote from Scripture, specifically from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 27. Quote, that he, our Lord, might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. The church is without spot, without blemish, without sin. The church, which is to be distinguished from the human element of the church. Whenever you hear me say, oh, the church approved this, we're talking about the human element. We're talking about bishops and priests and popes and the rest of it who themselves are typically not without spot or blemish. Now, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we don't usually cite the modern catechism because that's a really bad catechism compared to previous versions, but in paragraph 796, the concept is described in this way. Quote, the unity of Christ and the church, head and members of one body, also implies the distinction of the two within a personal relationship. This aspect is often expressed by the image of the bridegroom and the bride. The theme of Christ as bridegroom of the church was prepared for by the prophets and announced by John the Baptist. The Lord referred to himself as the bridegroom. The apostle speaks to the whole church and of each of the faithful members of the body as a bride betrothed to Christ the Lord, so as to become but one spirit with him. The church is the spotless bride of the spotless Lamb. Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her. He has joined her with himself in an everlasting covenant and never stops caring for her as his own body. End quote. You also get from the Apocalypse, or for whatever reason Catholics now are calling it by the Protestant name of the Book of Revelation, In the first letter to the Corinthians, we get a picture painted for us. Basically, in the book of Revelation, Christ is presented as the bridegroom, and the church is his spotless bride. The relation of the bride to her bridegroom recalls the wholehearted devotion which we are meant to have to Christ. And it is for this reason, allegorical testimony, if you want to call it that St. Paul tells us that while the one who marries does a good thing, the one who remains celibate does better. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 38. The vocation to consecrated virginity is greater than that to married life, not because the individual is necessarily more holy, but because the virgin is a clearer sign of the kingdom which is to come, where they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. Moreover, it's happier to remain celibate, happier in the whole sense of holiness. An unmarried woman or a virgin is anxious about the things of the Lord, so that she may be holy in both body and spirit. A married woman, on the other hand, is anxious about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. I am telling you this for your own benefit, not to impose a restraint upon you, but for the sake of propriety and adherence to the Lord without distraction. See 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 34 to 35. The church is the spotless bride of Christ. Okay? It's holy, it is without blemish. That's not saying the human element who run the church or the laity like you and I aren't great sinners. We are, first among them is me. We are great sinners. Bear that in mind, because all that is to get to this. Francis's letter, which accuses the church of having spots or sins. And in that letter, he says that seminarians should read the writings of those who were suppressed by the church, meaning heretics. I love it. It's really subtle in there too, because if you were to read it, you'd probably stop reading the letter before it got to all that, because it's a pretty bland thing and doesn't seem all that bad, because he talks about the need for priests to understand church history, to read church history, to be well versed in church history. Obviously, that's true. The laity should have at least a passing familiarity with church history, and he expects priests to receive a formal education in that, and that's fine. But part of that reason he wants the priests, to understand church history, to be well educated in it, is for us to understand the sins of the church. He doesn't say the human element, he says the church. And he believes there's wisdom to be garnered by reading the condemned writings of heretics. So here's the first problematic paragraph. There are two of them that jumped out at me. I'm hoping some priests maybe will reach out to me and say, oh yeah, you should see this part of this letter too. Go here. And but when I read it yesterday, here are the two problem paragraphs. So let's go to the actual letter, get it up on screen so I can show you where this is. So he published it. The thing looks like it's a really long text, but he's got it published in like 5 languages in one document. So let's go down to here, to this paragraph here. It says, a proper sense of history can help each of us to develop a better sense of proportion and perspective in coming to understand reality as it is and not as we imagine it or would prefer reality to be. Setting aside dangerous and disembodied abstractions, we are able to relate to reality as it summons us to ethical responsibility, sharing, and solidarity. That sounds fine, right? We should not look at the world through rose-colored glasses. We should have a realistic view of what's actually happening in the world instead of letting ideology and other things cloud it. That sounds fine. Here's where he says about the church. According to an oral tradition whose written source I cannot confirm, a great French theologian used to tell his students that the study of history protects us from ecclesiological monophysitism, that is, from an overly angelic conception of the church, presenting a church that is unreal because she lacks spots and wrinkles. Indeed, the church, like our own mothers, must be loved as she is. Otherwise, we do not love her at all, or what we love is only a figment of our imagination. Church history helps us to see the real church and to love the church as she truly exists, and love what she has learned and continues to learn from her mistakes and failures. A church that, even in her darkest moments, is conscious of her deepest identity, can be capable of understanding the imperfect and wounded world in which she lives in. In her efforts to bring healing and renewal to the world, she will use the same means by which she strives to heal and renew herself, even if at times she does not succeed. End quote. The church has spots and imperfections. I just started by telling you from Scripture and the Catechism, and there are plenty of saints talking about this too, that the church is the spotless bride of Christ. She is without perfection because she was established by Jesus Christ. It is the human element that are the sinners. And here he's not making that distinction. It may sound like I'm nitpicking, but remember something here. This is not a document in isolation. What is the great promise of synodality? A new synodal church. A new synodal church that does not claim supremacy, that does not claim that it is essentially what Jesus said it is, that it is the church established by Christ on the rock of Peter, outside of which there is no salvation. A synodal church that envisions anyone who is baptized in the Trinitarian form as being a member of the church, which is not exactly the truth. That is sort of a post-conciliar conception of it. There's also things like submission to the Roman pontiff and other such things that are required for you to be a member of the church. All that tossed out the window. I'm reminded of, I believe it's Our Lady of La Salette, warning people that the church, that there would come a time when those in the church would apologize for the church's glorious past. This is planting the seed of that, even though we've been dealing with that for a long time. Now, he goes on to say church history has been shaped by ideologues driven by a need to promote a narrative. What is that narrative? Well, that the church is the spotless bride of Christ, outside of which there is no salvation. That's the ideological narrative. So we go to the second problematic paragraph here. Got to find it here so you can see it with me, just so you can actually see that I am not making this up. Let's take a look again at my notes. So what he says here is this. A further observation, connected to the previous one, touches on the link between church history and ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the theology of the church. What is the church? What is its mission in the world? How does it relate to the world? A further observation, connected to the previous one, touches on the link between church history and ecclesiology. Historical research has an indispensable contribution to make in the development of an ecclesiology that is both truly historical and mysterious. Again, his claim has always been that the ecclesiology of the church after Vatican II makes things like pre-conciliar devotions, pre-conciliar forms of the liturgy incompatible with the church today, because the church has a new ecclesiology, which is a fancy way of saying it's a new church. It says the penultimate observation, which is very close to my heart, concerns the canceling of insights from those whose voices were not able to make themselves heard over the centuries. That's a nice way of saying heretics. This makes faithful historical reconstruction a difficult task. Here I ask myself, is it not a privilege for the church historian to bring to light as much as possible the popular faces of the least important and to reconstruct the history of their defeats and the oppressions they suffered, together with their human and spiritual riches, offering tools for understanding today's phenomenon of marginalization and exclusion? We get the idea that the church is the spotless bride of Christ because of ideological considerations, promoted by those who oppressed dissenting voices who wanted to offer an alternative idea. These are the heretics. That's what he's saying. And that we will get a truer sense of the church and her history by studying those who were silenced by the Holy Office, the Holy Inquisition back in the day. That is what he's saying here. This is his instructions to priests. It's a remarkable document. I'll be honest with you, one of the most remarkable documents I've seen him write, in that it's mostly fine because it is objectively true. Priests need to understand church history better than the typical layman. They need to be well versed in church history. That way they can help people combat heresies, or they can help the average person who encounters a Protestant so-called theologian who says, hey, the church did all these evil things in history, yada, yada, yada. Your church is actually fake. You should go join Pastor Bob's Sunrise Church located in the strip mall next to B-Dubs. That's the one true church. And then your priest is supposed to help you navigate that nonsense. But unfortunately, what you get here instead is a rejection of the concept of the church as being the spotless bride of Christ, the church as an oppressor of dissenting opinions. By the way, that's really rich coming from him, who is known for canceling bishops, canceling priests who dare to ask basic questions. But that is what he's talking about. And I haven't seen anybody else comment on this letter. Not yet, anyway. I'm hoping that today or tomorrow we'll get some articles at Rorate Caeli and some other places from more learned minds on this subject than I to point out to you other errors that are in this, because I'm sure they're there. But he is talking the very idea that you can view the church as basically the great villain of history through the lens of looking at the insights of those that the Holy Office thought were dangerous and should be kept at arm's distance. That is one of the most remarkable things that I have seen. And this does point to a larger phenomenon. Moving on here to a story that I think is kind of tangentially related. You see, there's a bishop, Jose Ignacio Munilla. He gave an interview to a Spanish news site called El Debate, probably saying that wrong. And in his interview, he has some words of wisdom. And this is, I think, an important topic today for us to think about. Many Christians have become enemies of the cross, seeking the applause of the world while not rectifying their own internal disposition, their own internal sinful disposition, their inclination to sin, their inclination to treat their neighbor like garbage, all of it. This bishop accuses the human element of the church of seeking consensus with the world and using the institutions of the church by not preaching against positions the world holds dear, such as the James Martin sin, because it's a hard thing to do. You don't get the admiration of the world when you do that. And instead, the human element of the church focuses on things that the world agrees with or is easy for the church to adapt its teachings to, like, say, the issue of people moving around a lot from one place to another, or care for our common home, to bring up something that, because you may have forgotten, we are firmly in the anniversary year of Laudato Si, the most self-referential thing Francis has ever done. He issued Laudato Si on care for our common home, and that happened in 2015, and we are in this sort of 10-year anniversary celebration of it, which is the weirdest thing, if you read church history, the weirdest thing to actually see. But he points all of this bishop points all of this to being part of the secularization of the church. And about the only thing the bishop doesn't do here is point out that this temptation puts church leadership on the same side of hot button political discussions as the rulers of the world, many of whom stand against what their people want on these issues, and often the human element of the church twisting the teachings of the church to accommodate those who are actually the enemies of Christ. But the bishop's overall point is accurate. Christians have become lukewarm in preaching the truth to the world, and we must take a hard stand against the overreaches of the secularists and resist this temptation to secularize our own thinking. And so this was published on a website called El Debate under the headline, "Some Christians Seek the Applause of the World." The Bishop of Orihuela Alicante does not shy away from issues in which we know that the Christian worldview is very contrary to what is socially accepted. I'm going to go over a few of the questions and answers he gave, because you'll see that he's basically correct here. He just, in my estimation, doesn't go far enough to point to church leadership as part of the problem. So he has asked the following question. You mentioned in your speech that there is a, quote, certain secularization within the church itself, a Christianity that seeks to be socially applauded. Where are the symptoms? How can they be identified? How to avoid having the sour face that Pope Francis warns about? Familiar with the sour-faced saints comments from Francis? That a lot of people would-be saints in our time are pretty dour figures. Yeah, how to avoid that, how to avoid becoming a negative Nelly, basically. The bishop's response is, a symptom that we may be falling into an area of secularization where the only thing that is sought is the applause of the world is limiting or curtailing the preaching of the church to certain areas in which it is easier to seek a social consensus, and leaving silent other aspects in which we know that the church worldview is very contrary. It is much easier, for example, to have an ecological discourse or one on the phenomenon of human beings moving about a lot than to talk about other problems such as anthropological wounds or the influence of the James Martin lobby or Christian thinking about marriage as made by God and conforming to nature. Or about what we truly think about why the James Martin sin is not part of God's plan when he created man. I believe that integrity is very important to preaching faith and morality. The fact that St. John the Baptist was a martyr for moral truth and that he lost his head for having denounced that Herod was living with a woman who was not his wife should challenge us. There are certain things that we seem to have forgotten. Each person must examine his conscience. There must be integrity in preaching without adapting the preaching of the gospel to his own sensibilities. I mean, do not adapt the gospel to your own worldview. It is true that when preaching moral truth, when it goes against the grain, can lead to having a sour face. But I believe that moral truth must be shown in its beauty. For example, the fact that we show the joy of the gospel in families that are faithful to marriage, in family counseling centers that have saved them from marital breakdown, in people who have received support for their emotional wounds, and thanks to that have been able to move forward. Some may think that addressing countercultural issues is only entering into the genre of denunciation. And I believe that there must also be a proclamation that there is hope, that the great moral evils that are spreading do not fill the heart of man. Those who have had the experiences of being rescued from these moral evils are the first witnesses. This is far from translating into a sour face, but quite the opposite. It is a testimony of hope, which means that the style with which things are done is very important. End quote. He's not wrong. It's very easy for us to denounce the sins of the world without presenting a joyful alternative. And I can tell you, as a adult convert myself, I can tell you that one of the things that really brought me into the church was I saw the moral chaos outside, but I could never figure out what was at the core of it, what was wrong. It was a friend of mine who was Catholic taught me about what the church taught about holy matrimony. And that was the thing that finally did it for me, which is not what I would have expected if you had talked to me 10 years before it happened. But that's what it was. And they taught it was the beauty of what the church teaches. That was what counteracted the own sort of sinful godlessness in my own life. And here, this bishop's kind of driving at that point that you can use the beauty of the truth to counteract the evils of the world. Not merely denunciations, but you actually have to actually offer something else beyond just saying no. There's a lot of truth to it. And then he's asked, lately there have been priests and nuns in the media who talk a lot about building bridges, seem to be seeking to reconcile themselves with the world where everything fits. We must be understanding with women who have had the sacrifice to Moloch, with with men with the James Martin inclination. We cannot be so harsh with divorcees. Are they wolves in sheep's clothing? To which he says, I think that the great temptation in seeking balance is to admit that there is a contradiction between truth and charity. If we admit that, if we believe in that dialectic, then we are lost. We do not believe that there is a contradiction between saying, Woman, I do not condemn you, go in peace, and adding, Sin no more. Jesus Christ is the truth, and Jesus Christ is charity. He is not a half truth to make it easier to combine him with mediocrity. He who believes in this dialectic must deep down say, I must lower the truth that it is easier to combine it with mediocrity. No, that is to have fallen in the Hegelian dialectic, to seek a synthesis after a thesis and after an antithesis. We do not believe in that. We believe that Jesus Christ is truth and charity. Let me give you a simple example of what this looks like in real life. Weirdly, right now over on X, you will see Catholics, usually young Catholic men, usually with anonymous accounts, pictures of saints or anime characters as their little avatar, yelling at people for moral failings. And this isn't just for like current unrepented moral failings. They're actually going after people who have publicly repented of their sins, but saying that those people should just shut up and not speak on anything. It's rather disturbing because there is a remarkable lack of charity in all of this. This isn't merely that the person that they're attacking has sinned. They are going after people who have publicly repented of their sins and people who, because of those past sins of theirs, might actually know something about being mired in that kind of sin. They're told to just shut up. That doesn't help anything. Now, the bishop goes on and is asked, "You also said in your lecture that we have become enemies of the cross and that we must embrace the cross." The interviewer says, "I remember a priest preaching along the same lines, but he said, first, one must know to identify the cross, because if not, one can end up embracing crosses that are not one's own." Here's what he means by being an enemy of the cross. This is not the we have we are, antichrist, little a antichrists. Doesn't mean it that way, and it doesn't mean that we are trying to destroy the faith or anything else. You have to remember, sin darkens the intellect, and when you are in it, not in a state of grace, you have placed yourself in opposition to Jesus Christ. It's a hard teaching. You'll see the saints say it 1,000 times throughout history, and the church repeating this in the various preconciliar catechisms. So here is what the bishop has to say. He says, if we're not embracing crosses that are not one's own, he replies, that's true. Because, for example, there may be someone who is suffering a lot because of family relations or within the company. And deep down, behind that suffering, what happens is that I have jealousy or a wounded self-esteem or an inferiority complex. It's very important that I do not make a victim-like interpretation. I have the worst coworker or the worst brother-in-law in the world. Look, the problem is not with the brother-in-law. I I have jealousy or I have a huge inferiority complex. Of course, I have to embrace the cross, but it is true that it has to be identified. It has to be named. As always, the biggest cross is within ourselves. That is why very important to identify, not mistake our enemy. It is also very important to identify the evil one, to unmask his temptations and be aware that the biggest cross we carry is our own wounds, which we have forged in our lives by our sins. What he's saying when we have become enemies of the cross is that our own sins mask our perception of things, and that we have essentially in some way or another we lash out at other people because of our own sinful nature. It's a hard thing for people to hear, but is he wrong in saying that? Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please, and we'll check here in the live chat. The Galilean dialectic is basically the alchemical formula of solvate coagula. That's what it is, right? That's why when you get like Francis's weird document, that's what you're seeing there. He's talking about how to educate priests into thinking that the church essentially was not a good isn't a good institution, but has been an author of chaos and an author of evil in the world. Damon Keller says, I have a sister, third order member of the Carmelites, who teaches the Novus Ordo Catechism and says the church is imperfect. Its members are imperfect. I'm the heretic because I don't go along with the new definitions. Right. I mean, we have to remember that, Francis in that document was saying that the church has spots, and he never once makes the distinction between the church and its human element. The church is the spotless bride of Christ. You have to remember that. The church is holy. Its human element, not so much. But the church itself is holy. It is a supernatural institution instituted by Jesus Christ on the rock of Peter. And as such, it is holy. It is without spot. You and I are far from being without spot, for vast majority of people watching this. And that is why that document, I'll be surprised if this thing doesn't get shredded by people who are better at analyzing theological problems than I am. I'll be shocked if they don't shred this thing in the next 36 hours. At least I would hope they would. So any final thoughts here in the live chat? Get them in now. Otherwise, we will wrap this up. I will suggest to people that they pray also, of course, for Francis and the rest. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.